450 million years ago, before the first tree ever took root, before birds existed, before dinosaurs, before the rings of Saturn, sharks were already here. Not as visitors, not passing through. They were home. The oceans they entered were nothing like the ones we know today. The continents were unrecognizable. The atmosphere was different. And the sea was full of things that no longer exist. But what came next was something far worse than unfamiliarity. 5 times, the planet nearly reset itself completely. 5 separate events that didn't just wipe out species, they collapsed entire worlds. Food chains didn't just break, they vanished. Sunlight faded behind clouds of debris. Oxygen drained from the oceans. Temperatures swung so violently that creatures with nowhere to run simply stopped. 96% of all marine life disappeared in one of them. 96. And yet, when the oceans cleared, sharks were still there. The armored fish that once ruled the seas? Gone. The great marine reptiles that came after them? Gone. The dinosaurs that dominated land for over 150 million years? Gone. Sharks passed through all of them. Once might be luck, twice might be resilience, 5 times is something else entirely. 5 times the world tried to erase them, yet they survived. Tonight, we follow the story of how sharks made it through all the extinction events on Earth. If you're tucked in right now, phone dimmed, trying to let your brain slow down, this one was made for you. Give it a like, subscribe if you haven't, it's free, and it helps our channel more than you can imagine. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Settle in. 450 million years is a long time, but we've got all night. Long before the oceans carried the shapes we would recognize, the earliest traces of sharks appear not as bodies, but as fragments, scattered impressions pressed into stone. Tiny scales, worn and mineralized, surface from ancient sediments like quiet signals from a distant world. They do not resemble the sleek predators that glide through modern seas. They are subtle, almost easy to overlook, yet they mark the beginning of a lineage that had only just entered the experiment of life beneath the waves. These first hints belong to the Paleozoic oceans, a realm that would feel unfamiliar in nearly every way. The water moved over continents arranged differently, coastlines shifting across immense spans of time. Trilobites crawled along the seafloor in vast numbers, their segmented bodies catching dim light filtering from above. Armored fishes drifted through the water, encased in heavy plates that gave them an ancient, almost mechanical presence. Early reef systems rose slowly, built not by modern corals, but by simpler organisms, forming layered structures that shaped the shallow seas. Within this setting, the earliest shark-like creatures did not stand apart as dominant hunters. They were part of a broader unfolding, one branch among many, as vertebrate life explored new forms and possibilities. Their bodies were not yet refined for speed or precision in the way later sharks would be. Instead, they carried a simpler design, still emerging, still adjusting to the demands of a world that had not yet settled into stability. What defines them most clearly in the fossil record is not bone, but the absence of it. Cartilage formed the internal structure of these early fish, a flexible framework that rarely preserved well over deep time. Where bone leaves behind strong and lasting impressions, cartilage tends to vanish, dissolving into the long processes of burial and pressure. As a result, much of their story remains incomplete, pieced together through scales, teeth, and the faint outlines of what once moved through ancient water. This difference in structure carries a quiet significance. Cartilage allows for lighter bodies and a different kind of movement, one that bends and yields rather than resists. It shapes how these early creatures interacted with their surroundings, how they navigated currents, and how they responded to the shifting conditions of their environment. Yet, it does not stand alone as an explanation for what would come much later. It is one element among many, a part of a larger pattern that cannot be reduced to a single advantage. The oceans they entered were not gentle or predictable. Conditions changed over long spans, sometimes gradually, sometimes with greater force. Life adapted, expanded, and contracted in response. In this vast and uncertain setting, early shark lineages did not rise to immediate prominence. They existed alongside countless other forms, each testing its own way of surviving within the same shared waters. There is a quiet humility in their beginning. They were not the largest, nor the most heavily protected, nor the most visually striking inhabitants of their time. They did not dominate the seas they moved through. Instead, they occupied space within a much larger system, one that was still defining itself, still shifting in ways that would later reshape everything within it. From these small and fragmentary origins, a theme begins to take shape. Sharks did not emerge as rulers waiting to inherit the ocean. They began as participants, woven into an ancient network of life that was experimenting with form, movement, and survival. Their presence at this early stage does not yet explain endurance, but it establishes something more subtle, a starting point rooted not in dominance, but in continuity. Across deep time, the record of life settles most clearly beneath water, layered into sediments that remember what the surface forgets. Long before forests spread across continents, or animals shaped the land in familiar ways, the oceans held the majority of living complexity. Shells, scales, and skeletal fragments drifted downward and became part of a slow archive, pressed into rock where change could be traced with unusual clarity. In these layers, the story of extinction appears again and again, not as isolated moments, but as patterns first written in the sea. Marine life filled vast, interconnected spaces, yet much of it depended on environments that were surprisingly narrow in depth and condition. Shallow continental seas, spread across the edges of ancient landmasses, supported dense communities where light could still reach the seafloor. These regions were neither fully ocean nor fully land, but something in between, rich with life that relied on stable conditions. When sea levels shifted, even by what might seem a modest amount on a planetary scale, these habitats contracted or vanished entirely. Coastlines moved, seabeds were exposed, and entire ecological networks lost the spaces that had sustained them. This sensitivity to depth made the oceans responsive to broader planetary changes. As ice formed or melted, as tectonic forces reshaped basins, the distribution of water itself altered the living world. A falling sea did not simply lower a shoreline, it erased environments that had taken millions of years to establish. A rising sea could flood new areas, but the transition was not always smooth, and the communities that once thrived in stable shallows did not always follow or adapt. Beyond the boundaries of depth, the internal chemistry of the ocean shaped survival in ways less visible but no less decisive. Oxygen, carried through water by circulation and exchange with the atmosphere, determined where complex life could persist. In some periods, the ocean mixed freely, allowing oxygen to reach deeper layers. In others, stratification developed, separating surface waters from those below. When this occurred, deeper regions could lose oxygen gradually, creating zones where only limited forms of life could endure. Temperature worked alongside this, influencing both the movement of water and its ability to hold dissolved gases. Warmer conditions reduced the capacity of seawater to retain oxygen, while also accelerating biological processes that consumed it. Cooler conditions altered circulation patterns, sometimes strengthening mixing, sometimes disrupting it. These shifts did not act alone, but combined with other changes to reshape entire ecosystems from within. Acidity added another layer of influence, tied closely to the balance of carbon in the ocean and atmosphere. When this balance shifted, it affected the ability of organisms to build shells and skeletons, structures that form the foundation of many marine communities. Even small changes in chemistry could ripple outward, altering growth, reproduction, and survival across multiple levels of the food web. Food itself moved through these systems in delicate chains. Microscopic producers captured energy near the surface, supporting layers of consumers above and below. When conditions disrupted these primary sources, the effects traveled upward, thinning populations and reshaping interactions between species. A change at the base did not remain contained. It spread, weakening connections that had once seemed stable. In this way, extinction in the ocean unfolds less like a single event and more like a gradual unraveling. Habitats shrink or shift, chemistry drifts out of balance, circulation falters, and food webs begin to thin. Each change interacts with the others, creating a cascade that moves through the system over time. The record preserved in stone reflects this complexity, showing not a sudden silence, but a drawn-out transformation in which life retreats, adapts, or disappears as the conditions that sustained it slowly fall away. A slow cooling settled over the planet, not as a sudden shift, but as a long, steady change that altered the balance of the seas. Around 447 million years ago, during the late Ordovician, temperatures declined across vast stretches of Earth. Ice began to gather near the poles, first in quiet accumulation, then in expanding sheets that drew water out of the oceans and locked it into frozen mass. The surface of the planet changed its tone, and with it, the structure of the oceans began to tighten. As ice grew, sea levels fell. The broad, shallow regions that had once spread across continental margins began to withdraw, their waters slipping away from the edges of land. What had been wide and connected became narrower and fragmented. These shallow seas had supported dense communities, layers of life arranged within a delicate range of depth and light. As the water retreated, those spaces diminished, leaving organisms confined to smaller and more isolated pockets. The change did not announce itself with violence. It moved gradually, almost quietly, yet its effects reached across entire ecosystems. Where water once covered sediment in a thin, sunlit layer, exposure followed. Seafloors that had held living communities were left dry or transformed into environments no longer suited to the life that had depended on them. For many organisms, movement was not enough. Their existence was tied to conditions that could not simply be followed as the shoreline shifted. In the remaining waters, the environment continued to transform. Cooler temperatures influenced circulation patterns, altering how currents moved through the ocean. The distribution of nutrients shifted, affecting the base of food chains that supported larger and more complex forms. Even where water remained, it no longer behaved in the same way. Subtle changes accumulated, shaping a world that was becoming less stable for the life within it. This period marks one of the earliest great reductions in biodiversity, a moment when a significant portion of marine life disappeared from the record. The loss was not evenly distributed. Organisms that depended on shallow, stable conditions faced the greatest pressure. Their habitats had been the first to form and the first to contract. As those environments faded, so did many of the species that had evolved within them. The ocean did not fall silent all at once. Instead, it thinned. Communities that had once been dense became sparse. Interactions that had formed over long spans of time began to break apart. The structure of life, built slowly through countless generations, unraveled as the conditions that sustained it shifted beyond recovery. Each change reinforced the next, creating a sequence that moved steadily toward absence. There is a quiet contrast in this first great dying. Later extinctions would carry images of heat, darkness, or chemical disruption, but here the driving force was cold. The withdrawal of warmth reshaped the planet's surface and its seas, reducing the spaces where life could continue. The process carried a kind of stillness, an absence of sudden force, yet its reach was vast. Within this changing world, the earliest shark lineages were still part of the wider marine system, not yet distinct in the way they would later become. Their presence at this time places them within the same unfolding conditions, subject to the same pressures that affected countless other forms. The record remains incomplete, yet it suggests continuity rather than disappearance, a quiet persistence through a world that was becoming narrower and more uncertain. As the ice held its grip and the seas remained lowered, the balance of life adjusted to a reduced state. The first great biological silence did not arrive as a single moment, but as a gradual dimming where entire communities faded from the ocean's memory, leaving behind only traces embedded in stone. What can be known of that distant moment arrives in fragments, and much of it remains unresolved. The earliest traces of shark ancestry do not form a complete picture, and the boundary between true sharks and their close relatives is still drawn with caution. Scales and scattered remains offer glimpses, yet they do not always reveal how these animals lived or how widely they were distributed. In this early chapter, certainty softens into careful inference, where presence is acknowledged but detail often fades before it can be fully recovered. Within that uncertainty, the broader changes shaping the oceans provide a frame for what these early lineages may have encountered. As cooling progressed and water withdrew from continental margins, the geography of the seas shifted in ways that would have altered migration paths, feeding grounds, and breeding areas. Coastlines moved across distances that, while gradual in geological terms, would have transformed habitats across generations. Regions that once supported life became less accessible or disappeared entirely, leaving only deeper or more isolated waters behind. For small and developing lineages, such changes would not have been abstract. Movement through the ocean depends on the continuity of space, and when that continuity breaks, populations can become separated. Isolation introduces new pressures, altering the flow of genetic exchange and reshaping how groups respond to their surroundings. Some may adapt to narrower conditions, while others diminish without leaving a lasting record. The fossil evidence does not always distinguish between these outcomes, yet both are part of the same unfolding process. Food webs, already sensitive to shifts in environment, would have been affected as well. As habitats contracted, the distribution of prey species likely changed, becoming uneven or reduced in certain regions. Early shark ancestors, not yet specialized in the ways seen later, would have relied on whatever resources remained available within their reach. Variability in food supply introduces a quiet but persistent strain, influencing growth, reproduction, and survival over time. These pressures do not arrive as singular events, but as ongoing adjustments that shape each generation. Environmental turnover extended beyond space and food. Changes in temperature and circulation would have influenced the conditions of the water itself, altering how nutrients moved and how life was sustained at different depths. In some areas, conditions may have remained relatively stable, offering continuity for those already present. In others, subtle shifts could accumulate, gradually making the environment less suitable for certain forms of life. The early shark lineage, still diverse in its emerging forms, would have experienced these differences unevenly. There is a quiet significance in the timing of their appearance. These early ancestors entered the oceans during a period when the planet revealed its capacity for large-scale transformation. Their history begins alongside instability, not after it. This does not suggest resilience in the sense it would later be understood, but it places them within a system where change was already a constant presence. Their existence unfolds within that context, shaped by conditions that were neither fixed nor predictable. The absence of complete fossils leaves much unsaid, yet the patterns preserved in surrounding life provide a sense of the pressures that defined the time. Marine communities were thinning, habitats were shifting, and the structure of ecosystems was being reorganized. Within this broader transformation, early shark lineages persisted in ways that are only partially visible, their presence marked more by continuity than by detail. What remains is not a clear narrative of survival, but a quiet indication that some branch of this lineage moved through a changing world without disappearing entirely. The evidence does not reveal how many forms were lost or how many endured, only that the lineage itself did not vanish at this early stage. It continues forward, carrying with it a history that began in uncertainty, within oceans that had already begun to change their shape. When the cold began to loosen its hold, the world that remained did not resemble the one that had been lost. The seas, once filled with layered communities and steady rhythms, carried a different texture, quieter, more open, marked by absence as much as by what still moved within them. The retreat of ice allowed waters to return to former margins, yet the life that had depended on those spaces did not reappear in the same form. What followed was not a restoration, but the beginning of something altered and incomplete. Across these recovering oceans, ecological emptiness spread in subtle ways. It was not an absolute void, but a thinning, where interactions that had once been dense and continuous became sparse and uneven. Niches that had been occupied for millions of years stood open, waiting for life to return or reshape itself to fill them. The balance between species, once held through long adaptation, had been broken, leaving behind a system that had to be rebuilt from reduced foundations. Those lineages that persisted through the extinction did not emerge as untouched survivors. They were fragments of what had existed before, carrying forward only a portion of their former diversity. Populations were smaller, distributions more limited, and the connections between groups often weakened. Survival, in this context, was not a sign of dominance or advantage, but an indication that some part of a lineage had endured the conditions that erased so many others. Within this altered world, early shark ancestors continued as part of that reduced tapestry. Their presence in the fossil record suggests continuity, yet it does not imply abundance or stability. Like many other surviving groups, they existed within an environment that had been reshaped in ways that required adjustment over long spans of time. The conditions that followed the extinction were not immediately favorable. They were transitional, marked by gradual shifts rather than sudden renewal. Recovery unfolded slowly, measured not in generations as we experience them, but across intervals that stretch far beyond immediate perception. New communities formed through a process of expansion and replacement as surviving lineages explored the spaces left behind. Some adapted to conditions that differed from those their ancestors had known, while others diversified into new forms, responding to opportunities created by the absence of competitors. This process did not follow a single path. Different regions of the ocean recovered at different rates, shaped by local conditions and the availability of surviving species. In some areas, life returned with relative steadiness, rebuilding layers of interaction over time. In others, the return was delayed, and the structure of the ecosystem remained simplified for extended periods. The ocean, vast and interconnected, did not heal uniformly. For shark lineages, endurance during this phase meant existing through these extended intervals of change. Their story is not confined to the moment of extinction itself, but continues through the long aftermath that follows. It is within these recovery phases that the foundations for future diversification are laid, where surviving groups expand, adapt, and gradually reestablish their presence within the broader system. There is a quiet shift in understanding that emerges here. Survival is not a single event, nor a decisive victory over catastrophe. It is a continuous process, carried forward through conditions that remain uncertain long after the initial disruption has passed. The persistence of a lineage depends not only on withstanding the moment of crisis, but on navigating the altered world that follows. As the oceans slowly regained complexity, the remnants of earlier life became the starting point for what would come next. The shapes of future ecosystems were not predetermined, but formed through the gradual accumulation of change, guided by the interactions of those that remained. In this way, the legacy of survival extends beyond endurance alone, shaping the path through which life rebuilds itself over time. Light filtered through Devonian waters in a way that revealed movement at nearly every depth, a layered world where forms drifted, hunted, and settled across an ocean that had grown rich with variation. Time had carried life forward from earlier disruptions, and in this interval, the seas seemed to gather themselves into something fuller, more intricate, and more densely inhabited than before. The planet entered what would later be called the Age of Fishes, a span marked not by a single dominant group, but by an expanding array of vertebrate life exploring new ways to exist in water. Jowled fishes spread through these oceans with increasing presence, their structures allowing for new methods of feeding and interaction. Some carried heavy armor, their bodies encased in protective plates that gave them a steady, deliberate movement. Others adopted lighter forms, their shapes streamlined for more active swimming, tracing paths through open water or along the seafloor. The diversity was not only in appearance, but in behavior, as feeding strategies multiplied and ecological roles became more defined. Reef systems developed alongside this expansion, forming complex environments that supported a wide range of life. These were not identical to later coral reefs, yet they created similar patterns of shelter and interaction, where small organisms found protection and larger ones moved through in search of food. Within and around these structures, relationships between species deepened, forming networks that linked producers, grazers, and predators into interconnected systems. Food webs during this time reached a level of complexity that allowed for multiple layers of dependency. Energy moved from microscopic organisms upward through successive levels, supporting communities that were both diverse and dynamic. The balance within these systems was maintained through countless interactions, each one contributing to the overall stability of the environment. In such a setting, abundance gave the impression of continuity, as if the ocean had settled into a lasting rhythm. Within this broader expansion, shark lineages continued to diversify, taking on a variety of forms that reflected the opportunities and pressures of their surroundings. They were no longer limited to the earliest expressions of their ancestry, but had begun to branch into different ecological roles. Some occupied positions closer to the seafloor, while others moved more freely through open water. Their presence became one part of a larger pattern, contributing to the evolving structure of marine life rather than defining it. This diversification did not occur in isolation. It was part of a wider radiation of fish groups, each exploring its own path within the same expanding environment. The Devonian seas were filled with experiments in form and function, a period where evolutionary possibilities seemed to widen across multiple lineages at once. Sharks, in this context, were participants in a shared unfolding, shaped by the same forces that influenced other vertebrates. As these systems grew more intricate, they also became more interconnected. Dependencies increased, and the balance between different parts of the ecosystem became more finely tuned. What had once been simpler structures now relied on a greater number of relationships, each one contributing to the stability of the whole. This complexity allowed for richness, but it also introduced sensitivity, as changes in one area could ripple outward through the system. The Devonian oceans, viewed in their fullness, present a world that appears secure, filled with life at many levels and sustained by elaborate networks of interaction. Yet, beneath this surface of abundance lies a quiet tension. Systems that achieve greater complexity often depend on conditions that must remain within certain limits. When those limits are approached or crossed, the very connections that support diversity can begin to strain. In this way, the flourishing of the Devonian does not stand apart from what comes later. It forms a moment where life reaches outward, expanding into new possibilities, while also becoming more dependent on the stability of the environment that sustains it. The seas hold a sense of continuity, yet within that continuity rests the potential for change, carried forward as part of the same ongoing story. In certain layers of Devonian rock, the color deepens into dark bands that stretch across ancient seabeds, quiet records of a changing ocean. These deposits, often called black shales, formed where organic material settled into waters that held little oxygen, preserving what would otherwise have decayed. They do not mark a single instant, but a repeated pattern, appearing again and again across different regions, suggesting that something within the seas had begun to shift in a sustained and uneven way. Around 378 million years ago, this pattern became part of a broader transformation, now recognized as the Late Devonian extinction. The causes of this event are not fixed to a single explanation. Different lines of evidence point toward multiple influences, yet one idea returns with particular weight: a gradual loss of oxygen within large portions of the ocean. Instead of a uniformly mixed body of water, the seas may have become stratified, separated into layers that did not exchange as freely as before. Surface waters, in contact with the atmosphere, retained more oxygen and continued to support visible life. Below, deeper layers grew increasingly depleted, creating conditions that limited what could survive there. This separation changed how the ocean functioned as a whole. Circulation, which once carried oxygen downward and nutrients upward, became less effective in certain regions. The connection between depths weakened, allowing oxygen-poor zones to expand and persist. Organic matter, drifting from above, accumulated in these deeper layers, where it was broken down in ways that consumed the remaining oxygen. Over time, this process reinforced itself, extending the reach of low oxygen conditions across broader areas. At the surface, the ocean still held movement and activity. Fish continued to swim, reefs still provided structure, and food webs remained in motion. From above, the sea might have appeared stable, even thriving in places. Yet beneath that surface, the environment was becoming more restricted, narrowing the spaces where complex life could exist. The difference between layers introduced a quiet imbalance, one that was not immediately visible but carried lasting consequences. The Late Devonian extinction did not unfold as a single, sharp event. Instead, it appears as a sequence of stresses and recoveries, a drawn-out process that extended over long intervals. Certain groups declined gradually, others experienced sharper losses, and some persisted through multiple phases of change. This complexity reflects an ocean that was not failing in one moment, but shifting in ways that created repeated challenges for the life within it. As oxygen levels dropped in parts of the ocean, habitats that had once been stable became uncertain. Organisms adapted to specific ranges of depth and chemistry found those ranges altered or reduced. Movement between layers, already shaped by biological and environmental factors, became more constrained. The pathways through which species interacted, fed, and reproduced began to narrow, influencing survival in ways that were not uniform across the entire marine world. Shark lineages, continuing their diversification during this time, were part of these changing systems. Their forms and habits placed them within different regions of the ocean, exposing them to varying degrees of the shifting conditions. Some may have occupied waters less affected by oxygen decline, while others encountered environments that were becoming increasingly difficult to inhabit. The fossil record reflects persistence, though it does not capture every transition that occurred within these groups. What emerges from this period is an image of a sea divided within itself, active above and constrained below. The contrast between layers created a situation where life could continue in one region while diminishing in another, producing a gradual reshaping rather than a sudden collapse. The richness of the Devonian did not disappear all at once, but thinned through time, as the underlying conditions that supported it became less stable. In these darkened sediments and shifting waters, the story of extinction takes on a different form, one defined not by immediate loss, but by a slow reduction in possibility. The ocean remained present, yet within it, the space for life to move and persist grew more limited, marking another passage in the long sequence of changes that shaped its history. The ocean can change in more than one way, and not all changes move through it with the same rhythm or reach. Cooling alters the shape of the sea, drawing water into ice and shifting where life can exist. Oxygen loss works differently, less visible at first, yet able to spread through the water itself, touching nearly every level of life without changing the surface in obvious ways. These two forces reshape the same world through entirely different paths, and the difference lies in how deeply they move through the system. When temperature falls and ice expands, the most immediate effect is spatial. Habitats shrink or relocate as shorelines move and depths change. Life is forced to follow or remain behind, constrained by the physical limits of where water remains. Some regions become unavailable, while others persist with altered boundaries. The pressure is uneven, concentrated in areas most directly affected by the shifting of the sea itself. Oxygen decline does not rely on the movement of coastlines. It moves through the water column, altering the chemistry of entire regions regardless of their position. In these conditions, the space may still be present, yet the quality of that space changes in ways that are less apparent but more pervasive. Water that once supported complex activity becomes difficult to inhabit, not because it disappears, but because it no longer carries the conditions required for sustained life. This difference reshapes how ecosystems respond. In a cooling world, organisms may find refuge in areas where conditions remain suitable, even if those areas are reduced. In an oxygen-poor environment, refuge is harder to locate. The limitation is not always tied to geography, but to the invisible balance of gases within the water. Zones of low oxygen can expand and contract, creating shifting boundaries that affect multiple habitats at once. The pressure extends through the entire food web. At its base, microscopic organisms that rely on specific conditions may decline or change in distribution. This alters the flow of energy upward, affecting those that depend on them for sustenance. As prey becomes less available or concentrated in smaller areas, predators encounter new challenges. Movement patterns shift, feeding becomes less predictable, and the connections that once supported stable populations begin to weaken. For animals that rely on active swimming, the presence of sufficient oxygen is closely tied to their ability to move, hunt, and maintain their internal balance. When oxygen levels drop, even slightly, the range of possible activity narrows. Some species adjust by reducing movement or shifting to areas where conditions remain more favorable. Others find their options limited, their behavior constrained by the environment in ways that accumulate over time. This form of stress does not always produce immediate absence. Instead, it introduces a gradual tightening, where life continues, but within increasingly restricted limits. The system remains active, yet it operates under strain, with each layer of the ecosystem feeling the effect in different ways. Over extended periods, these pressures can lead to reductions in diversity and changes in the composition of communities, even without a single defining moment of collapse. The contrast between these types of extinction pressures reveals something broader about life in the ocean. Each event shapes survival through its own mechanisms, testing different aspects of how organisms exist and interact. Enduring one set of conditions does not ensure endurance in another, because the challenges are not the same. Adaptations that allow persistence in a cooling world may not offer the same advantage in a system where the water itself becomes less supportive. Within this shifting framework, the story of survival becomes more complex. It is not a matter of passing a single threshold, but of continuing through a sequence of different conditions, each with its own demands. The ocean, vast and interconnected, does not apply its pressures in a uniform way, and the life within it must respond to changes that do not repeat in the same form. Across long stretches of time, a pattern begins to emerge that does not belong to a single form, but to a collection of forms moving together under one name. What is often called a shark is not one fixed design carried unchanged through the ages, but a broad assembly of related lineages, each shaped by its own path through the ocean. Their differences are not always visible at a glance, yet they define how each branch interacts with its surroundings, how it feeds, how it moves, and where it is able to persist. This variety has been present for much of their history. As the seas changed, shark lineages did not follow a single direction. Some developed bodies suited to steady cruising through open water, while others remained closer to the seafloor, adapting to environments where movement was slower and more deliberate. Diets varied alongside these forms, ranging from small prey gathered in passing to larger organisms that required different strategies to capture. Even within a shared ancestry, these distinctions created a wide range of ecological roles. The significance of this diversity becomes clearer when the ocean itself begins to shift. When conditions change in one region, not all forms are affected in the same way. A lineage tied closely to a specific habitat may encounter immediate pressure, while another, occupying a different space or relying on different resources, may continue with less disruption. The broader group does not experience change as a single, unified event, but as a series of uneven impacts that move across its many branches. Scientific discussions have often returned to this idea when considering how sharks persisted through repeated periods of environmental stress. Rather than relying on a single defining trait, their endurance appears linked to the spread of their forms across multiple ways of living. This distribution acts as a quiet buffer, not preventing loss, but reducing the likelihood that all branches will face the same pressures at the same time. Diversity, in this sense, becomes a form of continuity. Within such a system, extinction does not erase the entire lineage at once. Certain branches may decline or disappear, their specialized roles leaving gaps that are not immediately filled. Others remain, carrying forward traits that allow them to persist under altered conditions. Over time, these surviving groups may expand or change, contributing to new expressions of the lineage. The process is not one of simple survival, but of ongoing transformation shaped by the shifting environment. This way of existing differs from the idea of a single dominant species enduring through strength or superiority. It reflects a more distributed presence, where resilience is shared across many forms rather than concentrated in one. Each branch contributes to the overall continuity, even if its own path eventually ends. The lineage persists not because every part survives, but because enough variation exists to carry it forward through change. In the context of deep time, this pattern offers a quiet explanation that does not rely on dramatic adaptation or singular advantage. It suggests that endurance can arise from the ability to occupy multiple positions within a system, to exist in different ways that are not all vulnerable to the same disruptions. The ocean, with its layered environments and shifting conditions, provides a setting where such variety can develop and persist. As earlier passages have hinted, the forces shaping extinction are not uniform, and the responses they demand are equally varied. A lineage spread across many forms is not immune to these forces, yet it is less likely to be entirely removed by any one of them. This does not guarantee survival, but it changes the odds in subtle ways, allowing continuity to emerge from difference. In this broader view, sharks are not defined by a single advantage, but by the accumulation of many small differences, each one a thread within a larger pattern. Together, these threads form a structure that can bend without breaking completely, carrying the lineage through conditions that would otherwise bring it to an end. Inside collections of stone and sediment, long rows of small objects rest in careful order, each one a fragment of a body that no longer exists. Teeth, ridged and worn, sit beside tiny scales that once covered living skin. They are often separated from one another, found in different layers, carried by currents before settling into place. Taken alone, each piece feels incomplete, yet together they form the most enduring record of a lineage whose softer structures rarely remained intact. What sets these animals apart begins beneath the surface of their bodies, in a framework built not from dense bone, but from cartilage. This material bends and yields, providing support without the rigidity seen in many other vertebrates. It allows for movement that flows more easily through water, shaping bodies that can adjust and respond to currents with subtle precision. Over time, this structure contributes to forms that are streamlined and efficient, capable of sustained motion across varied environments. Yet cartilage carries with it a kind of invisibility in deep time. Unlike bone, it does not readily harden into a form that persists through the long processes of burial and transformation. As a result, much of what once defined these animals is absent from the fossil record. The shapes that moved through ancient seas are often reduced to scattered elements, leaving gaps that must be bridged through careful interpretation. Teeth, by contrast, endure. Composed of harder materials, they are shed and replaced throughout the life of the animal, creating a steady supply of structures that can become preserved. These teeth vary in form, reflecting different feeding strategies and interactions with prey. Some are shaped for cutting, others for grasping or crushing, each design offering a glimpse into how these animals engaged with their surroundings. Over generations, countless teeth enter the sediment, building a record that is both abundant and detailed in certain aspects. Scales add another layer to this record. Often small and textured, they provide information about surface structure and protection. Like teeth, they are more likely to survive than the softer tissues they once accompanied. Together, these elements create a partial archive, one that emphasizes certain features while leaving others unseen. The result is a history assembled from fragments, where presence is clear, but full form remains elusive. Beyond structure, sharks possess sensory systems that extend their awareness of the environment in ways that are not immediately visible in stone. Specialized organs allow them to detect subtle changes in pressure, movement, and electrical signals in the water. These abilities shape how they locate prey and navigate their surroundings, integrating them into the complex dynamics of marine ecosystems. Such features do not fossilize, yet they are central to understanding how these animals functioned within their environments. These biological traits, taken together, contribute to the long-term success of the group. Flexibility in structure, continuous renewal of teeth, and refined sensory systems all play roles in how sharks interact with the ocean. They influence feeding, movement, and survival across different conditions. However, none of these features alone provides a complete explanation for endurance through large-scale environmental change. They are parts of a broader pattern, elements that support persistence but do not guarantee it. The fragmentary nature of the fossil record reinforces this perspective. What remains is shaped by what can endure, not by what was most important in life. Teeth and scales offer clarity in some areas, while leaving others obscured, creating an incomplete but meaningful picture. Within this quiet arrangement of preserved pieces, the history of sharks is present not as a continuous form, but as a collection of enduring details, each one carrying a small part of a much larger story. Continents drew closer together over immense spans, assembling into a single vast landmass that altered the shape of the planet's surface and the movement of its waters. This was the Permian world, late in the Paleozoic, where coastlines stretched in long, continuous arcs and interior regions lay far from the influence of the sea. The oceans adjusted to this new arrangement, their basins redefined, their pathways redirected, their connections reshaped by the slow convergence of land. With fewer separate margins and broader interiors, the distribution of shallow marine environments changed. Areas that once existed as extensive, sunlit platforms became more limited in extent, while deeper waters occupied a larger share of the ocean's volume. Currents that had once flowed between scattered continents followed new routes, influenced by the altered geometry of the planet. These changes did not occur all at once, yet over time, they reshaped the conditions under which marine life existed. In such a setting, the appearance of stability can be persuasive. Ecosystems continue to function, species persist, and interactions maintain a sense of continuity. Yet beneath that surface, pressures can accumulate slowly, each one subtle in isolation but significant in combination. Shifts in temperature, circulation, and chemistry can begin long before their full effects become visible, creating a foundation of stress that may not be immediately recognized. Geography plays a central role in this gradual build. When continents merge, they influence atmospheric patterns, altering wind systems and the distribution of heat. These changes, in turn, affect the oceans, modifying how water moves and mixes. Regions that once exchanged freely with others may become more isolated, while new connections form in unexpected ways. The balance between different parts of the ocean becomes more complex, shaped by forces that extend beyond the water itself. As these adjustments continue, the spread of shallow marine habitats remains sensitive to shifts in sea level and continental configuration. Expansions and contractions of these environments influence the diversity and distribution of life, creating periods where communities grow and others where they diminish. Over long intervals, these fluctuations can set the stage for larger transformations, altering the resilience of ecosystems before any singular event occurs. Within this evolving world, shark lineages and other marine groups continued their histories, adapting to the conditions presented by changing seas. Their presence persisted through these adjustments, yet like all life within the ocean, they were part of a system that was gradually being reshaped. The forces at work did not target one group alone. They influenced the entire network of interactions that defined marine ecosystems. The idea of an extinction as a sudden break can obscure the reality of how such events often develop. In the Permian, the groundwork for what would become the most extensive loss of life was laid over long spans of time. Environmental stress accumulated, sometimes quietly, sometimes in more noticeable shifts, but rarely as a single, isolated occurrence. Each change added to a larger pattern, one that moved steadily toward a point where the system could no longer sustain its previous complexity. There is a sense of gathering weight in this period, as if the ocean carried within it conditions that were slowly aligning toward a profound transformation. The stability that had allowed life to diversify and expand now held underlying tensions, shaped by geography, climate, and chemistry. These tensions did not yet resolve into a clear outcome, but they formed a backdrop against which future events would unfold. As the Permian world continued, the scale of what was building became increasingly significant. The changes were not confined to a single region or process, but extended across multiple aspects of the planet's systems. The ocean, vast and interconnected, reflected these shifts in its currents, its habitats, and the life it supported. What lay ahead would not be limited in scope or effect, but would reach across nearly all forms of life within the sea, marking a transition that would reshape the history of the planet in a way unlike anything that had come before. At the boundary between the Permian and Triassic, the record tightens into a stark transition, where layers that once carried a wide variety of forms narrow into something far more limited. Around 250 million years ago, this shift marks the largest of the major extinctions, a change so extensive that in some summaries, more than 95% of species disappeared. The scale of loss extends beyond any earlier event, reaching across the oceans with a depth that reshapes the entire structure of life. The causes trace back to forces that had been building beneath the surface for a long time. Vast volcanic eruptions spread across what is now Siberia, releasing immense volumes of gases into the atmosphere. These eruptions did not occur as a single outburst, but as repeated activity over extended periods, gradually altering the composition of the air and, in turn, the chemistry of the oceans. Carbon dioxide accumulated, driving temperatures upward and changing how the planet stored and moved heat. As warming intensified, the oceans responded in ways that compounded the stress. Warmer water holds less oxygen, and circulation patterns that once distributed that oxygen became less effective in certain regions. At the same time, chemical balances shifted, affecting the ability of organisms to maintain their structures and metabolic processes. The combination of rising temperatures and altered chemistry created conditions that were increasingly difficult for many forms of life to endure. The effects were not isolated to individual species. Entire systems began to fail. The relationships that connected producers, consumers, and predators broke down as each level experienced its own pressures. When the base of the food web weakened, the impact moved upward, reducing the availability of energy for larger organisms. Habitats that had once supported complex interactions became simplified, then emptied, as the conditions required for those interactions could no longer be sustained. In the oceans, this process unfolded as a gradual but relentless reduction. Areas that had once been active and diverse lost their capacity to support the same range of life. Oxygen-poor zones expanded, and in some regions, conditions may have approached levels that limited nearly all complex activity. The water itself became a more restrictive medium, shaping what could survive not only through physical space, but through its internal composition. The fossil record reflects this change with a starkness that stands apart from earlier events. Diversity declines sharply, and the forms that remain represent only a fraction of what had existed before. Reef systems collapse, leaving behind intervals where their presence is absent or greatly reduced. Groups that had persisted for long spans vanish entirely, their histories ending within this transition. For shark lineages, the pattern is one of uneven survival. Some branches disappear, while others continue, though not in the same abundance or distribution as before. Their persistence does not imply immunity, but indicates that within the broader group, certain forms were able to endure the altered conditions. The lineage continues, but it carries the marks of loss, shaped by the same forces that affected the wider marine world. What defines this extinction is not only the number of species lost, but the collapse of the systems that had supported them. The ocean does not simply lose inhabitants. It loses the structures that allowed those inhabitants to exist together. The balance between different parts of the ecosystem breaks down, leaving behind a reduced and reorganized environment. There is a weight to this moment that differs from earlier changes. The processes leading to it were extensive, and the outcome reflects a level of disruption that reaches into the foundation of marine life. The ocean, still present, no longer functions in the same way. Its capacity to sustain complexity diminished across large regions. In this passage of deep time, the Great Dying stands as a point where the continuity of life is strained to its limits. What remains moves forward into a world that has been profoundly altered, carrying with it only a portion of what once filled the seas. Temperature does not rise in isolation. It carries consequences that move through water in ways that reshape the conditions for life at every level. As the Permian seas warmed, the balance that once supported widespread activity began to shift towards something more restrictive. Warm water, by its nature, cannot hold as much dissolved oxygen as cooler water, and this simple physical change had far-reaching effects. Where oxygen had once been available across broader depths, it now became less abundant, narrowing the spaces where complex organisms could function. At the same time, the movement of water that might have redistributed oxygen was altered. Circulation weakened in certain regions, reducing the exchange between surface and deeper layers. Oxygen that entered at the top did not travel as effectively downward, leaving deeper zones increasingly depleted. In these areas, the remaining oxygen was consumed faster than it could be replaced, creating conditions where survival required less energy, less movement, and in many cases, a complete absence of activity. The combination of warmth and reduced oxygen placed a steady strain on marine life. Organisms that relied on active movement found their capacity limited, as the energy required to sustain that movement exceeded what the environment could support. Even those adapted to lower oxygen conditions encountered thresholds beyond which normal function became difficult. The ocean remained present, yet within it, the cost of living rose steadily, shaping which forms could persist and which could not. In certain regions, chemical changes extended beyond oxygen loss. Evidence suggests that some waters may have developed toxic conditions, influenced by microbial processes that thrived in low oxygen environments. Compounds such as hydrogen sulfide, normally confined to deeper or isolated zones, could have spread into areas where more complex life had once existed. These substances altered the chemistry of the water in ways that further restricted habitability, adding another layer of difficulty to an already strained system. Food webs, already sensitive to environmental change, began to fragment under these pressures. Primary producers, affected by shifts in temperature and chemistry, altered their distribution and productivity. As the base of the system weakened, the effects moved upward, reducing the availability of energy for higher levels. Predators encountered fewer opportunities to feed, and the connections that linked different parts of the ecosystem became less reliable. Over time, these disruptions reduced the overall complexity of marine communities. Ocean acidity may have played a role during this period as well, influenced by the same processes that increased atmospheric carbon dioxide. Changes in acidity can affect the ability of organisms to build and maintain structures, particularly those composed of calcium-based materials. While such conditions likely contributed to the stress experienced during the extinction itself, evidence suggests that they did not persist in the same way once the immediate crisis had passed. The impact, though significant, appears to have been part of a broader set of overlapping pressures rather than a single defining factor. Within this environment, survival became increasingly demanding. It was not only a matter of finding space or food, but of existing within water that imposed constraints on basic biological processes. Breathing, movement, growth, and reproduction all depended on conditions that were becoming less supportive. Each of these processes required energy, and as the environment provided less, the margin for sustaining life narrowed. The seas during this time did not simply lose inhabitants, they became places where maintaining life required more than before. The balance between what organisms needed and what the environment could offer shifted in a way that reduced the number of viable paths forward. Some lineages persisted, adapting or enduring within these limits, while others declined as the cost of survival exceeded what could be sustained. In this setting, the ocean itself takes on a different character, still vast and continuous, yet altered in its capacity to support the diversity it once held. The processes at work do not act in isolation, but combine to create a world where even the simplest functions of life are shaped by a persistent and demanding environment. From the scattered record that follows the end of the Permian, continuity appears in fragments rather than in a clear, uninterrupted line. Teeth persist where other traces vanish, small but consistent signals that some part of the lineage endured. Yet the pattern they form is not one of stability carried cleanly across a boundary. It is uneven, marked by gaps and shifts, suggesting that what moved forward was not the full diversity that once existed, but a reduced and altered remnant. Within that remnant, change is evident. Certain forms disappear from the record, their distinct shapes no longer present in later layers. Others appear in new configurations, reflecting adjustments that took place during and after the crisis. The lineage did not pass through unchanged, and the idea of a single, continuous progression gives way to something more complex, where survival is accompanied by loss and continuity is shaped by transformation. This uneven passage reflects a broader principle. When a lineage spans multiple forms, occupying different ecological roles, it does not experience a global event as a single, uniform pressure. Instead, each branch encounters the changing conditions in its own way. Some are exposed directly to the most severe stresses, while others exist in contexts where the impact, though still present, is less immediate or takes a different form. The result is not complete preservation, but a distribution of outcomes where some paths end and others continue. In the aftermath of the Great Dying, this distribution becomes visible in the limited diversity that remains. The surviving shark lineages do not represent the full range of what had existed before. They are a subset, shaped by the conditions that allowed them to persist when many others could not. Their presence does not imply that they were unaffected, but that within the broader group, certain forms retain the capacity to continue under the altered environment. The processes that support this kind of survival are not singular or easily defined. They arise from a combination of traits, ecological positions, and interactions with the surrounding system. A lineage that exists across varied conditions is less likely to be entirely removed by a single type of stress, even one as extensive as the end Permian event. This does not reduce the severity of the extinction, but it changes how survival is distributed within the group. What emerges from this perspective is a sense of persistence that is grounded in variation rather than dominance. The continuation of sharks through this period is not the result of a single advantage carried intact across the boundary. It is the outcome of multiple forms, some lost, some altered, some enduring, each contributing to the presence of the lineage in the world that follows. The fossil record, limited as it is, reflects this pattern with a certain restraint. It does not present a dramatic return or a rapid recovery, but a quiet continuation where the signals of survival appear gradually and in reduced form. Over time, these surviving lineages would expand and diversify again, but in this immediate passage, the emphasis rests on what remained rather than what was regained. There is a weight to this survival that resists simple interpretation. It does not carry the tone of triumph, nor does it suggest that the lineage moved through the event without cost. Instead, it reflects a form of endurance shaped by loss, where continuation depends on the persistence of some parts rather than the preservation of the whole. In this way, the presence of sharks beyond the Great Dying becomes less a story of victory and more a record of continuity under strain. It acknowledges that survival at this scale is rarely complete or unbroken, and that what continues forward does so because enough variation exists within a lineage to carry it through conditions that remove much of what once defined it. Time after the boundary does not rush forward. It stretches, almost suspended, as if the ocean itself must relearn how to hold life again. The layers that follow the end Permian record do not fill quickly with new forms. Instead, they show a lingering simplicity, where only a limited range of organisms persists, and the density of interaction remains thin. The richness that once characterized earlier seas does not return in any immediate sense, leaving behind a world that feels incomplete, still carrying the imprint of what has been lost. Recovery in this setting unfolds slowly and without a clear pattern. Some regions show signs of renewed activity earlier than others, while vast areas remain reduced for extended spans. The unevenness reflects a system that is not rebuilding all at once, but in scattered patches, influenced by local conditions and the presence of surviving lineages. Where life does return, it does so cautiously, expanding into spaces that no longer hold the same constraints, yet also lack the complexity that once shaped them. These empty or simplified environments create openings, not in a sudden or dramatic way, but as quiet absences waiting to be occupied. Roles that had been filled by earlier organisms now stand without direct successors. Predatory niches, grazing pathways, and structural positions within ecosystems remain available, forming a kind of ecological framework without its previous inhabitants. The ocean, though diminished, still offers the potential for new arrangements of life to emerge. Surviving lineages move into these openings over long intervals. Some expand their range, adapting to conditions that differ from those their ancestors experienced. Others develop new forms, shaped by the absence of competitors and the altered structure of the ecosystem. This process, often described as radiation, does not occur as a rapid burst, but as a gradual unfolding, where variation accumulates across generations and spreads through the available spaces. Shark lineages, among others, are part of this quiet expansion. Their persistence through the extinction allows them to participate in the rebuilding process, not as dominant figures, but as contributors to the reformation of marine systems. They occupy roles that reflect both continuity and change, carrying forward traits that endured while adapting to the conditions of a world that is no longer the same. Their presence becomes more visible again over time, yet it remains shaped by the long interval of reduction that preceded it. The pace of this recovery extends beyond immediate perception. What appears as a brief transition in the geological record represents millions of years of gradual change, where each step builds upon the last. The ocean does not return to its previous state in a single movement, and in many ways, it never fully restores what was lost. Instead, it forms new configurations, drawing from the remnants that remained and the possibilities that emerged in their absence. There is a sense of quiet persistence in this process. The ocean, though altered, continues to support life, and over time, that life grows more varied once again. The simplicity that follows the extinction gives way, slowly, to increasing complexity as interactions multiply and ecosystems regain depth. Yet this return is not identical to what came before, and the memory of loss remains embedded in the structure of what develops. Within this long passage, the idea of recovery shifts from restoration to transformation. The ocean does not heal by returning to an earlier condition, but by moving forward into new forms of balance. Life reestablishes itself through adaptation and expansion, guided by the conditions that now define the environment. As the layers accumulate, the record reflects this gradual change, showing a progression from reduced diversity toward renewed complexity. The process is neither immediate nor uniform, but it continues, carried forward by the persistence of those lineages that endured. In this way, the ocean remains a place where life can return, even after its most extensive losses, not through sudden renewal, but through the steady passage of time and the quiet work of change. In the long wake of loss, a different ocean begins to take shape, one that carries memory in its structure, but does not return to what once was. As the Triassic unfolds, the seas continue their slow rebuilding, not by restoring former patterns, but by assembling new ones from what endured. The outlines of ecosystems become clearer again, though they are arranged in ways that reflect the altered conditions left behind by the earlier collapse. Marine life expands into this changing world with a gradual confidence. Groups that persisted through the extinction begin to diversify, filling roles that had remained open for extended periods. The process is uneven, with some regions showing greater complexity sooner than others, yet over time, the overall structure becomes more layered. Interactions between species deepen, and food webs regain some of the connections that had once defined them, though they are now shaped by different combinations of organisms. Within this reformed ocean, sharks continue as part of the rebuilding system. Their presence is no longer limited to persistence through hardship, but extends into adaptation within a world that is still settling into its new balance. They occupy a range of positions, reflecting both continuity from earlier forms and the adjustments required by the changing environment. Their role is not singular or dominant, but integrated into a broader network of life that is itself still in motion. At the same time, new groups begin to emerge, adding layers of interaction that had not existed before. Marine reptiles, evolving from land-dwelling ancestors, enter the oceans and establish themselves as significant participants in the ecosystem. Their forms differ from those of earlier marine predators, introducing new methods of movement and feeding that reshape the dynamics of the seas. Over time, these reptiles become prominent features of the marine environment, sharing space with other groups that are also diversifying. The presence of these new competitors alters the structure of the ecosystem in subtle ways. Predatory roles become more varied, with different lineages occupying overlapping or adjacent niches. This creates a dynamic where interactions are shaped not only by availability of prey, but by the presence of other predators with differing strategies. The balance between these groups shifts as conditions change, reflecting the ongoing process of adaptation within the recovering ocean. Sharks, within this context, are no longer defined solely by survival through a single event. Their history moves forward into a phase where adaptation becomes continuous, responding to both environmental conditions and the presence of other evolving lineages. The pressures they encounter are different from those of the extinction itself, yet they remain significant, shaping how these animals develop and persist within the system. The ocean of the early Mesozoic is not a stable endpoint, but a stage in an ongoing transformation. The rebuilding that began after the Great Dying continues, influenced by new evolutionary pathways and shifting environmental factors. The interactions between species, once reduced, now grow more complex again, yet they are built upon a foundation that has already been reshaped. There is a quiet sense that the processes affecting life in the ocean are not finished. The changes that allowed for recovery also create new conditions that will influence future developments. The presence of diverse predators, the reestablishment of food webs, and the continued adjustment of environmental factors all contribute to a system that remains in motion. Within this evolving world, sharks persist as part of a larger story that extends beyond a single moment of endurance. Their presence reflects both continuity and adaptation, shaped by the same forces that influence all marine life. The ocean, though recovering, continues to present conditions that require adjustment, and the lineages within it move forward through a landscape that is still being defined. Along a later boundary in the rock, the record tightens once more, showing a shift that echoes earlier disruptions yet carries its own distinct pattern. Around 200 million years ago, near the close of the Triassic, another major extinction unfolds, one that removes a large portion of life from both land and sea. Some summaries estimate that roughly 80% of species disappear during this transition, a loss that follows a long interval of rebuilding and reorganization. The forces behind this event trace back to extensive volcanic activity associated with the opening of what would become the Atlantic Ocean. Vast regions of the planet release lava and gases over extended periods, altering the composition of the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide accumulates again, driving a rise in global temperatures and influencing the balance of the oceans. These changes do not occur in isolation, but interact with existing systems, amplifying their effects across multiple layers of the environment. As temperatures increase, the oceans respond with shifts in both circulation and chemistry. Warmer conditions reduce the capacity of water to hold oxygen, while also influencing how that oxygen is distributed. At the same time, the absorption of excess carbon dioxide alters the chemical balance of seawater, affecting the processes by which many organisms maintain their structures. These combined changes reshape the conditions of marine habitats, not through the removal of space, but through the alteration of the water itself. This event can be understood as another broad chemical transformation of the seas, where the underlying properties of the ocean shift in ways that influence nearly all forms of life within it. The changes extend from the smallest producers to larger consumers, moving through the system as a series of interconnected effects. As primary production is altered, the flow of energy through food webs becomes less stable, influencing the survival of organisms at multiple levels. The impact is not instantaneous, but unfolds over time, with periods of stress and partial recovery marking the transition. Some groups decline gradually, while others experience more abrupt losses, reflecting differences in how they interact with the changing environment. The pattern, though complex, leads to a significant reduction in diversity, leaving behind a marine world that is once again simplified compared to what had existed before. Shark lineages, continuing their presence through this interval, encounter these changes within the context of their own diversity. Some forms persist while others diminish, reflecting the uneven distribution of pressure across different ecological roles. Their continuation through this period does not imply uniform success, but indicates that within the broader lineage, certain branches remain capable of enduring the altered conditions. The timing of this extinction carries a particular weight. The ocean, still in the process of rebuilding from the earlier Great Dying, faces another significant disruption. The structures that had begun to regain complexity are once again reduced, and the process of recovery is interrupted before it can fully stabilize. This repetition underscores the ongoing nature of change within the planet's systems, where periods of growth and decline follow one another over extended spans. The tone of this transition remains steady, without the abruptness often associated with sudden events. Instead, it reflects a continuation of the processes that shape life in the ocean, where chemical and physical changes accumulate and influence the system over time. The result is another reorganization of marine ecosystems, one that alters the course of life without erasing it entirely. In this passage, the ocean demonstrates its capacity to endure repeated transformations, though not without cost. Each event reshapes the conditions under which life exists, requiring lineages to adjust or decline. The persistence of certain groups reflects their ability to navigate these changes, yet it also highlights the ongoing challenges posed by a world that does not remain fixed. A single disruption can be understood in isolation, shaped by one set of conditions and one path of consequence, but when such disruptions return in different forms across deep time, their meaning begins to change. What might first appear as an unlikely survival becomes something more layered, defined not by one passage through danger, but by many, each shaped by a different force. The continuity that follows is no longer tied to a single moment, but to a sequence of trials that do not repeat in the same way. Across these intervals, the nature of pressure shifts from one form to another. Cooling narrows the boundaries of the sea, altering where life can exist. Oxygen loss changes the internal character of the water, influencing how organisms function within it. Rising temperatures reshape both circulation and chemistry, affecting conditions at multiple depths. Acidification alters the balance needed for certain structures to form and persist. Darkness, introduced in later events, interrupts the flow of energy at its source, influencing entire food systems from their foundation. Each of these pressures acts as a different filter, selecting for forms of life that can continue under its specific conditions while reducing those that cannot. The filters do not overlap perfectly, and they do not test the same traits. An organism that persists through one type of change may not carry the same capacity through another. Survival in this context is not a single achievement, but a series of passages, each requiring a different alignment between life and environment. For a lineage to remain present across these varied conditions, it must encounter each filter in a way that allows at least part of it to continue. This does not imply uniform strength or a fixed advantage, but rather a distribution of traits and positions within the ecosystem. Some branches may be more suited to one set of conditions, others to another, and over time, this variation becomes a means through which continuity is maintained. From a storytelling perspective, this sequence alters how survival is perceived. It is not a matter of overcoming one great challenge and returning unchanged. Instead, it becomes a pattern of endurance shaped by repeated exposure to different forms of stress. Each event leaves its mark, reducing, reshaping, and redistributing the lineage before it encounters the next set of conditions. The cumulative effect is not simply additive, but transformative, influencing how the lineage exists at every stage. The contrast between these events also highlights the unpredictability of the environment. The ocean does not apply its pressures in a consistent manner, and the forms of life within it cannot rely on a single strategy to persist. Conditions shift in ways that require ongoing adjustment, and the outcomes of one event do not determine those of the next. This variability introduces a level of uncertainty that extends across the entire history of the lineage. Within this framework, the persistence of sharks becomes less about a single explanation and more about the interaction between diversity and changing conditions. Their continuity reflects a capacity to exist across multiple contexts, each shaped by different environmental factors. The lineage does not pass through identical challenges, but through a sequence of distinct ones, each influencing its structure in different ways. The scale of this pattern becomes clearer when viewed across the full span of these events. It is not the survival of one moment, but the continuation through several, each separated by long intervals of change and recovery. The ocean, shifting in temperature, chemistry, and structure, presents a series of conditions that do not align, yet the lineage remains present within them. In this way, the story moves beyond a single instance of endurance and becomes a broader reflection of how life persists under varying pressures. The repetition of extinction events, each with its own characteristics, reveals a deeper dimension of survival, one that is shaped by the ability to move through difference rather than withstand a single form of change. Seen across long spans, the shark body does not settle into a single outline, but adjusts in quiet ways to the conditions around it, shaping how movement, feeding, and daily existence unfold within shifting seas. The form carries a certain continuity, yet within that continuity lies a range of possibilities, each one tuned to a different part of the ocean and a different way of living inside it. Movement is one of the most visible expressions of this variation. Some sharks travel steadily through open water, their bodies arranged for sustained motion across large distances, tracing paths that follow currents or the distribution of prey. Others move with less urgency, staying closer to the seafloor, where the pace is slower and the environment more structured. In these regions, movement becomes a matter of positioning and timing rather than constant travel, reflecting a different relationship with the surrounding space. Feeding follows these patterns of movement, taking on forms that correspond to what each environment offers. In open water, feeding may involve pursuing prey that moves in schools or appears in shifting patches, requiring awareness of both direction and opportunity. Near the seafloor, feeding can depend on locating organisms that are less mobile or more concealed, drawing on different sensory cues and behaviors. Along coastlines, where conditions change with tides and currents, feeding strategies adapt to a setting that is itself in constant motion. Body size varies alongside these differences, influencing how sharks interact with their environment and the kinds of roles they occupy within marine systems. Smaller forms may navigate tighter spaces or rely on prey that is abundant but limited in scale, while larger individuals move through broader ranges, engaging with different levels of the food web. Size, in this context, is not a measure of advantage alone, but a reflection of how each form aligns with its surroundings. Habitat adds another layer to this range of existence. Some sharks remain close to coastal regions, where the interaction between land and sea creates a dynamic environment shaped by sediment, light, and changing water conditions. Others occupy offshore waters, where the environment is more expansive and less influenced by immediate terrestrial factors. There are also those that stay near the bottom, moving through areas defined by structure and depth, as well as forms that remain in the open water column, where the sense of boundary is less defined. These differences in habitat and behavior mean that environmental change does not affect all sharks in the same way at the same time. A disruption that alters conditions along coastlines may not extend with equal force into deeper or more distant waters. Changes that influence the seafloor may leave open water less affected, at least for a period. The result is a distribution of impact, where some modes of life are challenged more directly, while others continue under conditions that remain relatively stable. Life strategies also vary, shaping how sharks reproduce, grow, and respond to the availability of resources. Some develop slowly, investing in fewer offspring, while others follow different patterns that allow for more rapid renewal. These strategies influence how populations respond to change, affecting their ability to persist through periods of reduced stability or altered conditions. Taken together, these variations form a quiet survey of possibilities within a single lineage. Sharks do not exist as one uniform presence, but as a collection of forms that engage with the ocean in multiple ways. This flexibility does not prevent loss, and it does not remove the pressures imposed by changing environments. It does, however, create a structure in which not all paths are exposed to the same risks at once. Within this range of movement, feeding, and habitat, the shark lineage continues to adjust, shaped by the same forces that influence the broader marine world. The ocean presents different conditions across its depths and distances, and within those conditions, these animals find varied ways to exist, each one part of a larger pattern that extends through time. Across the Mesozoic seas, presence does not belong to a single lineage, and the idea of one group holding complete dominance begins to soften when viewed against the wider arrangement of life. Sharks, though continuous in their history, move within an environment shared by other formidable predators, each shaped by different origins and carrying distinct ways of moving through the ocean. Among these, marine reptiles emerge as a significant force, their forms adapted from terrestrial ancestors into bodies suited for life in water. These reptiles do not simply enter the ocean as minor participants. Over time, they develop into large and capable hunters, occupying roles that intersect with those of other predatory groups. Their bodies reflect a different evolutionary path, yet they achieve a presence that influences the structure of marine ecosystems. Some move with streamlined efficiency through open water, while others inhabit coastal or mid-depth regions, creating a layered system of predation that extends across multiple environments. In this setting, sharks are not isolated at the top of a singular hierarchy. They exist alongside these reptiles, sharing access to prey and space within the ocean. The interactions between these groups are not always directly visible in the fossil record, yet their coexistence suggests a balance shaped by multiple forms of predation. Each group contributes to the dynamics of the system, influencing how energy moves through the food web and how different species interact within their environment. This shared presence extends across long intervals, emphasizing that the ocean does not maintain a fixed arrangement of dominance. The roles within marine ecosystems shift over time, influenced by the appearance and disappearance of different groups. Earlier in Earth's history, armored fishes had occupied prominent positions within the seas, their heavy structures defining a different form of predatory and defensive interaction. Their decline created openings that were later filled by other lineages, including sharks and marine reptiles. As time progresses, these roles continue to change. Marine reptiles, once a defining feature of Mesozoic oceans, eventually diminish, their presence fading from the record. The disappearance of such groups does not leave a permanent void, but alters the balance within the ecosystem, allowing other lineages to expand or shift into new positions. Sharks, among these, continue their history through these transitions, adapting to the changing structure of the ocean as different competitors rise and fall. This pattern reveals a broader principle about survival across deep time. It is not only shaped by environmental conditions, but also by the presence of other organisms that occupy similar or overlapping roles. The rise of a new predator can alter the availability of resources, the structure of food webs, and the interactions between species. The decline of that predator can create opportunities that were previously constrained. In this way, the ocean's history is marked by a continuous rearrangement of its inhabitants. For sharks, persistence through these shifts involves more than enduring environmental change. It includes existing alongside different competitors, adjusting to the presence of other lineages that influence how the ocean functions. Their continuity is not defined by constant dominance, but by the ability to remain part of a system that is itself changing in composition and structure. The scale of this interaction becomes clearer when viewed across the full span of the Mesozoic. The ocean hosts multiple groups that shape its dynamics, each one rising, expanding, and eventually declining. Sharks move through this sequence without remaining unchanged, yet without disappearing entirely. Their presence reflects an ability to navigate not only the conditions of the environment, but the shifting landscape of life itself. Within this broader view, survival takes on a different meaning. It is not solely about enduring physical changes in the planet, but also about existing within a network of relationships that evolves over time. The ocean does not offer a fixed stage, and those that remain within it do so by moving through cycles of competition, coexistence, and transition that extend far beyond any single moment. By the late Cretaceous, the oceans carry a sense of fullness, as if the long cycles of loss and rebuilding have once again arranged life into a layered and intricate system. Water stretches across basins shaped by earlier movements of continents, and within it, interactions unfold across many scales, from the smallest drifting organisms to the largest hunters moving through open space. The structure feels established, its patterns repeated across regions, giving the impression of continuity held over long spans of time. Near the surface, microscopic producers form the foundation of this system, capturing energy and sustaining a web that extends upward through successive levels. These plankton communities are abundant, spreading across wide areas and supporting populations that depend on their constant renewal. Their presence allows for dense concentrations of life, where energy flows steadily through chains of consumption, linking organisms in relationships that are both complex and interdependent. Above and within this foundation, larger animals move through the water in ways that reflect the diversity of roles now present. Marine reptiles, some reaching considerable size, glide or surge through open spaces, their movements shaping the behavior of other species around them. Fish of many forms occupy different layers, from near-surface zones to deeper regions, each adapted to the conditions of its environment. Sharks continue their presence within this arrangement, part of a system where predation is distributed across multiple groups rather than concentrated in one. Reef systems, though different in composition from earlier periods, contribute to the structure of coastal and shallow environments. They provide shelter and complexity, supporting communities that rely on both protection and proximity to food sources. These regions act as centers of interaction, where smaller organisms thrive and larger ones pass through, maintaining the connections that define the broader ecosystem. The food webs that arise from this arrangement are intricate, with many pathways through which energy can move. Redundancy exists within the system, allowing certain functions to continue even if one component is altered. This complexity gives the appearance of resilience, as if the ocean has reached a state where it can absorb change without losing its overall structure. The interactions between species, built over long intervals, reinforce this impression, creating a sense of balance that extends across different habitats. Yet this balance depends on conditions that remain within certain bounds. Temperature, chemistry, and the availability of light all contribute to maintaining the flow of energy and the stability of relationships within the system. When these conditions hold, the ocean continues in its established patterns, and life remains abundant across multiple levels. The continuity is real, but it is also contingent, shaped by factors that are not always visible within the daily movement of organisms. In such a world, the signs of change are not always immediate. The system can appear stable even as underlying conditions begin to shift. Subtle variations in temperature or chemistry may not disrupt the visible structure at first, yet they can influence the processes that sustain it. The complexity that gives the ocean its richness also introduces points of sensitivity, where changes in one area can propagate through the network of interactions. The late Cretaceous seas, viewed in this way, carry both abundance and a quiet tension. Life fills the water in diverse forms, and the relationships between those forms create a system that feels enduring. At the same time, the reliance on stable conditions means that the system's strength is linked to factors that can change beyond its control. Within this setting, the stage is set for another transition, not through visible instability, but through a shift that will affect the entire structure at once. The ocean, full and active, holds within it the potential for change, shaped by the same forces that have influenced it throughout its history. A thin, unusual layer appears at the boundary that closes the Cretaceous, a trace carried around the globe that signals a sudden interruption in the long continuity of marine life. Around 66 million years ago, a large asteroid struck near what is now the Yucatan region, an event now associated with the Chicxulub structure. The impact released energy on a scale far beyond ordinary geological processes, sending debris into the atmosphere and altering conditions across the planet. At the same time, volcanic activity in other regions may have been adding its own influence, contributing to an environment already under strain. The scale of loss that follows is substantial. Some summaries indicate that about 78% of species disappear during this transition, a reduction that affects both land and sea. In the oceans, the changes unfold in a manner distinct from earlier extinctions, shaped less by gradual shifts in temperature or chemistry and more by an abrupt alteration of the conditions that support life at its base. In the immediate aftermath, the atmosphere fills with dust and particles that reduce the amount of sunlight reaching the surface. The ocean, dependent on light for the productivity of its upper layers, responds quickly to this change. Photosynthesis declines as light becomes scarce, limiting the ability of microscopic producers to generate the energy that supports the rest of the system. The surface waters remain, but their capacity to sustain life is diminished in a way that reaches beyond any single region. As primary production weakens, the effects move upward through the food web. Organisms that depend on these producers encounter reduced resources, leading to declines that extend through successive levels. The connections that once linked different parts of the ecosystem begin to falter, not because of a gradual imbalance, but due to a sudden interruption in the flow of energy. Predators, including sharks, face a world where prey becomes less predictable and less abundant, altering patterns of movement and survival. This cascade does not occur in isolation. The initial impact may have triggered additional changes in temperature and chemistry, further influencing the conditions within the ocean. The combination of reduced light, altered climate, and disrupted circulation creates a complex set of pressures that extend across marine environments. The result is a widespread ecological shock where multiple systems experience stress at the same time. The character of this extinction differs from earlier events that unfolded over longer intervals. Here, the shift begins with an abrupt change, followed by a period where the consequences spread through the system. The ocean does not immediately return to its prior state, and the recovery that follows is shaped by the new conditions established during this interval. The layers that record this transition reflect both the suddenness of the initial event and the extended nature of its effects. Within this altered environment, shark lineages persist, though not without change. As with previous extinctions, their survival is uneven, with some forms continuing and others disappearing from the record. Their presence beyond the boundary reflects the same pattern seen in earlier passages, where continuity is maintained through a subset of the broader lineage rather than through complete preservation. The tone of this moment carries a sense of suspension, as if the ocean has paused between states. The usual movement of energy through the system is interrupted, and the interactions that define marine life are reduced in both number and intensity. The water remains, but its function as a medium for complex ecosystems is temporarily constrained. In this quiet interval, the history of life in the ocean reaches another point of transition. The extinction does not erase all forms, but it reshapes the conditions under which they exist, creating a boundary that separates one configuration of the marine world from the next. The character of change in this moment differs from the slow accumulation seen before, arriving not as a gradual shift in temperature or chemistry, but as an immediate reduction in light. Where earlier crises unfolded through warming waters and altered circulation over extended spans, this transition begins with a sudden dimming that affects the ocean from its very surface. The difference lies in the starting point, not in heat rising or oxygen declining first, but in the interruption of the energy that enters the system. When sunlight is reduced, the upper layers of the ocean lose the conditions needed for primary production. Microscopic organisms that rely on light to convert energy into biological material cannot continue at the same rate, and in many regions, their activity declines sharply. This change does not require a long buildup. It follows directly from the loss of illumination. The surface waters remain in place, yet their role within the ecosystem shifts almost immediately. Because marine food webs are structured from the bottom upward, this disruption spreads through the system in a distinct pattern. The smallest producers form the base upon which all higher levels depend. When their productivity falls, the reduction moves upward through successive layers, influencing herbivores, then predators, and continuing through the network of interactions that define the ecosystem. The sequence is not driven by the movement of water or the gradual change of chemistry alone, but by the absence of a fundamental input. In contrast to earlier greenhouse-driven crises, where rising temperatures and altered chemistry reshape conditions over time, the impact winter introduces a different kind of pressure. It reduces the supply of energy before it alters the structure of the environment itself. Organisms that depend on steady food availability encounter a system where that availability declines, not because habitats vanish or become chemically inhospitable, but because the production of energy at the base has been interrupted. This creates a pattern where the ocean appears present yet functionally diminished. The water retains its form, and many organisms continue to move within it, but the underlying support for those movements weakens. The absence of sufficient primary production introduces a form of scarcity that extends across habitats, influencing both shallow and deeper regions as the effects propagate through the food web. The difference between these types of crises also shapes how recovery may begin. In a warming-driven event, the return to more stable conditions depends on the gradual adjustment of temperature and chemistry. In an impact-driven event, the restoration of light becomes a key factor, allowing primary production to resume and energy to flow again through the system. Until that point, the ocean remains in a state where activity is reduced and connections are weakened. For shark lineages and other higher-level organisms, this shift presents challenges that differ from those encountered in earlier extinctions. Their survival depends not only on their own physiological capacities, but on the presence of prey that is itself affected by the decline in primary production. The disruption moves through the system in a way that influences availability rather than directly altering habitat, creating conditions where persistence is shaped by the cascading effects of reduced energy flow. There is an unusual stillness associated with this type of event, a sense that the ocean continues to exist while its internal processes slow. The dimming of light does not immediately remove life, but it changes the pace at which life can be sustained. The system becomes quieter in its activity, reflecting the reduced input that once drove its complexity. In this way, the impact winter stands apart from earlier crises, introducing a form of change that begins with darkness and extends through the structure of the ecosystem. It highlights the dependence of marine life on processes that are both simple and foundational, and it shows how the interruption of those processes can reshape the ocean in a manner distinct from other forms of environmental stress. Light returns to the surface in slow increments, not as a sudden restoration, but as a gradual easing of the dimness that had settled over the ocean. With time, the upper layers begin to regain the conditions necessary for primary production, and the smallest organisms resume their role in shaping the flow of energy through the system. The change is not immediate, and the pace remains measured, yet the direction shifts toward renewal as the processes that sustain marine life begin to function again. Within this emerging clarity, the ocean reveals a structure that differs from what had existed before. Many familiar forms are absent, and the relationships that once defined the system have been rearranged. The food webs that begin to reassemble are built from a reduced set of participants, expanding slowly as surviving lineages adapt to the altered environment. Each interaction contributes to a network that is both new and shaped by the legacy of the disruption that preceded it. Sharks continue through this transition, their lineage present within the rebuilding system. Their survival does not suggest that they passed through the extinction unchanged, but that some part of their diversity remained capable of persisting under the new conditions. As the ocean reorganizes, these surviving forms participate in the gradual reconstruction of marine ecosystems, occupying roles that reflect both continuity and adaptation. The communities that form during this period are not direct continuations of earlier ones. They are assembled from the remnants that endured, combined with new variations that arise as conditions stabilize. Marine vertebrate groups, including fishes and other lineages, reorganize in ways that are still being studied, with research continuing to refine the understanding of how these systems developed after the extinction. The record shows patterns of expansion and adjustment, but many details remain subjects of ongoing investigation. As energy once again moves through the ocean, the pathways it follows are not identical to those that existed before. The absence of certain groups alters the distribution of roles within the ecosystem, allowing surviving lineages to expand into spaces that had been previously occupied. This process does not restore the earlier balance, but establishes a different configuration, one that reflects the conditions of the post-extinction world. For sharks, this means that their presence continues within a changed context. Their interactions with other species, their access to resources, and their positions within the food web all adjust to the structure that is forming around them. The lineage persists, yet it does so within a system that has been reshaped, where the relationships that define survival are no longer the same as they were before. The passage through this transition carries a sense of emergence, as if the ocean is gradually regaining its capacity to support complexity. The initial simplicity that follows the extinction gives way to increasing diversity, though the process remains uneven and extended over long intervals. Each step builds upon the last, creating a progression that leads from reduced conditions toward a more intricate system. This phase does not represent a return to a previous state. The ocean that forms after the extinction is distinct, shaped by the absence of certain lineages and the presence of others that have adapted to the new conditions. The idea of normality shifts as what was once familiar is replaced by a different arrangement that becomes the basis for future development. In this quiet renewal, the continuity of sharks reflects their ability to move through change rather than to resist it. Their survival contributes to the reestablishment of marine life, yet it also underscores the transformation that accompanies each extinction. The ocean that follows is not a restoration of what was lost, but a new chapter, emerging slowly from the long interval of disruption and carrying forward only part of what once existed. In quiet drawers and layered stone, the story of sharks is held in fragments, each piece small, durable, and incomplete. What remains is rarely a full body, rarely a complete outline, but instead a scattering of hard traces that have endured where softer structures have not. The record is assembled from these remnants, gathered across continents and depths, forming a history that must be read with patience and care. Teeth are among the most common of these traces. They appear in abundance, shed and replaced throughout a shark's life, settling into sediments where they may be preserved over immense spans of time. Their shapes vary, reflecting different feeding strategies and ecological roles, and through them, patterns begin to emerge. By comparing these forms across layers of rock, paleontologists trace shifts in diversity, noting when certain types appear, expand, or disappear. Each tooth becomes a small marker of presence, a sign that a particular lineage once moved through that ancient water. Scales, though less frequently found, add further detail. These dermal structures carry textures and patterns that can hint at relationships between groups, offering another way to connect fragments into a broader picture. Together with teeth, they provide a partial map of shark evolution, one that reveals change through time even when the full anatomy is absent. The layers of sediment that contain these remains hold their own information. Each layer represents a specific interval, capturing the conditions under which it formed. By examining the sequence of these layers, scientists identify boundaries where sudden changes occur, where certain forms vanish and others begin. These transitions correspond to larger events in Earth's history, linking the presence or absence of shark remains to periods of stability and disruption. In this way, the record becomes not only a catalog of forms, but a reflection of the environments in which those forms existed. Yet, there are limits to what can be known. The skeletons of sharks are composed largely of cartilage, a material that does not preserve as readily as bone. As a result, much of their structure is lost before it can enter the fossil record. What remains are the harder elements, leaving gaps where details of body shape, musculature, and internal features would have been. This absence shapes the way their history is understood, requiring interpretation rather than direct observation. To work within these limits, paleontologists compare the fragments that do exist, using patterns of similarity and difference to infer relationships. They consider the distribution of fossils across different environments, noting where certain forms are found and where they are absent. They examine the context of each discovery, the surrounding sediments, and the associated organisms, building a picture that extends beyond any single specimen. This process is careful and cumulative, relying on the gradual addition of evidence rather than sudden revelation. The resulting history is both detailed and uncertain. It offers a view of change across immense spans of time, showing how shark lineages have appeared, diversified, and sometimes disappeared. At the same time, it leaves room for revision as new discoveries can alter existing interpretations. Each fragment carries information, but also ambiguity, reminding those who study it that the past cannot be reconstructed in full. There is a quiet discipline in this work, an acknowledgement that knowledge grows through measured steps. The fossil record does not provide a complete narrative, but a series of clues that must be arranged with care. It asks for restraint as much as curiosity, encouraging a balance between what can be said and what must remain open. Within these scattered remains, the continuity of sharks is visible, though never in a single, unbroken line. It appears instead as a pattern traced across layers and locations, a presence inferred through repetition and change. The story that emerges is one of persistence, shaped by evidence that is both enduring and incomplete, held within the stone as a record that invites understanding while resisting certainty. Across the long record of oceans reshaped and rebuilt, the outline of an answer begins to form, not as a single trait or moment, but as a pattern that repeats with variation. The continuity of sharks does not come from an unbroken line of identical forms moving unchanged through time. It emerges instead from a shifting mosaic, where some branches persist, others fade, and new ones arise within the same broader lineage. What appears constant from a distance is, up close, a sequence of changes held together by shared ancestry rather than fixed design. Within that pattern, loss is not an exception but a regular part of the story. Entire groups of early sharks vanished during earlier crises, their forms known now only through fragments preserved in stone. Later, even large and familiar figures that once dominated their environments did not continue indefinitely. One of the most well-known, Megalodon, disappeared by at least 3.6 million years ago, leaving behind teeth that mark its former presence without extending into the present. These endings do not stand apart from the larger narrative. They are part of the process that shapes it. What remains is not a collection of unchanged survivors, but a lineage that continues through turnover. As environments shift, certain forms are no longer suited to the conditions that follow. Others, already present in different habitats or occupying different roles, continue through the transition. Over time, these surviving groups diversify, giving rise to new variations that reflect the altered world. The continuity of sharks is therefore not a straight line, but a branching structure that adapts as the ocean itself changes. This broader resilience is tied to the range of ways in which sharks exist within marine systems. Some occupy open waters, others remain closer to the seafloor or along continental margins. Some rely on active predation, while others feed in ways that require different strategies and resources. These differences are not isolated traits, but part of a wider distribution of forms that spreads risk across multiple environments. When one region becomes less stable, not every part of the lineage is equally exposed. The passage through repeated extinctions reveals how this distribution functions over long intervals. Each event imposes a different set of pressures, altering temperature, chemistry, light, or the structure of food webs. No single adaptation prepares a lineage for all of these changes. Instead, survival depends on the presence of forms that can persist under the specific conditions that arise. The lineage continues because it contains within it a range of possibilities, some of which remain viable when others do not. Over time, this process creates a rhythm of reduction and expansion. After each disruption, the surviving branches form the basis for further diversification, gradually rebuilding complexity within the system. The result is a lineage that appears continuous when viewed across vast spans, yet is composed of many episodes of change, each one shaped by the conditions that preceded it. Continuity is achieved not through permanence, but through the ability to reorganize. There is a quiet clarity in this pattern. The idea of an organism enduring unchanged through every crisis gives way to a more intricate understanding, where persistence is linked to variation and adaptability across generations. The endurance of sharks reflects not a resistance to extinction, but a capacity to move through it, with some forms continuing while others conclude. In this way, the deeper answer settles into place without finality. Sharks remain not because they were exempt from loss, but because their lineage extended across enough forms and environments to endure the repeated reshaping of the ocean. Their history becomes an expression of continuity built from change, a long presence sustained through the shifting conditions of a planet that never remains still. The present ocean carries a different kind of change, one that does not arrive through distant geological forces or sudden impacts from beyond, but through the steady influence of a single species moving across the surface and into the depths. The water remains vast, currents continue their long circulation, and life persists within its layered structure. Yet the pressures shaping it now emerge from activities that unfold on human timescales rather than those measured in millions of years. Sharks, whose lineage has extended through earlier upheavals, remain part of this living system. Their presence today reflects the same continuity that has carried them through shifting climates, altered chemistries, and disrupted food webs. Yet the conditions they now encounter differ in both origin and pace. Instead of gradual environmental transformations or singular catastrophic events, the changes affecting them are widespread, persistent, and closely tied to patterns of human use and movement across the ocean. Fishing practices, both targeted and incidental, have become a significant influence on shark populations. Some species are sought directly, while others are caught unintentionally, within broader efforts aimed at different forms of marine life. These interactions reduce numbers in ways that accumulate over relatively short intervals, altering the structure of populations that once extended across wide regions. The removal of individuals does not remain isolated, but influences reproductive capacity, age distribution, and the balance within ecosystems where sharks play a role. In addition to direct capture, the broader transformation of marine environments contributes to the pressures now present. Coastal development, changes in water quality, and shifts in prey availability all shape the conditions under which sharks exist. These factors combine to create a situation where multiple influences act at once, each one affecting different aspects of the system. The result is not a single event that can be clearly defined, but an ongoing process that unfolds across many locations and scales. Current assessments suggest that more than a third of shark and ray species are now considered threatened with extinction, a proportion that reflects the extent of these combined pressures. This figure does not represent a single moment of loss, but an indication of trajectories that are moving toward reduction. The pattern differs from earlier extinctions in its distribution, affecting species in different regions simultaneously rather than concentrating its impact within a specific set of environmental conditions. The contrast with past events becomes more apparent when considering the nature of the change. Earlier extinctions were driven by forces beyond the influence of any single organism, arising from shifts in climate, volcanic activity, or impacts from space. The current situation, by comparison, is closely linked to human activity, making it both global in reach and immediate in its effects. The speed at which these changes occur introduces a new dimension, one that compresses the timescale of impact into intervals far shorter than those seen in the deep past. Within this context, the long continuity of sharks takes on a different significance. Their history demonstrates an ability to persist through varied and often extreme conditions, yet it does not imply immunity to all forms of change. The pressures now present operate through mechanisms that differ from those encountered before, influencing populations directly and across multiple environments at once. The ocean, as it exists today, continues to support complex systems, but those systems are increasingly shaped by interactions with human activity. The balance that once appeared to arise from natural processes alone now includes factors that originate from outside the marine environment itself. This shift alters the conditions under which survival unfolds, introducing variables that have no direct parallel in earlier intervals. In this quiet turning of the present, the continuity of sharks meets a form of change that is both familiar in its outcome and distinct in its cause. The lineage that has endured through 5 major extinctions now moves within a world where the forces shaping its future arise from a different source, one that acts with a reach and immediacy that extends across the entire ocean. Across the long span already traced, a pattern settles into view that extends beyond any single group, revealing something about how life moves through a planet that never remains still. The oceans have shifted in temperature, chemistry, depth, and light, and within those changes, entire communities have risen and disappeared. Sharks, carried through these passages, become less an exception and more a lens through which that broader movement can be seen. The idea of survival begins to lose its association with permanence. What endures is not a fixed form holding its place against all disturbance, but a lineage capable of existing across different conditions as they emerge. Dominance, when it appears, is temporary, tied to a particular arrangement of environment and relationships that does not remain unchanged. The record of the sea shows many examples of groups that once filled vast regions, shaping ecosystems around them, only to fade when those conditions shifted. In contrast, continuity across deep time reflects a different set of qualities. It involves range, not only in geography, but in the ways a lineage can live within its environment. It includes flexibility, expressed through variations that allow some forms to persist when others cannot. It carries endurance, not as resistance to loss, but as the capacity to continue through it, with portions of a lineage remaining even as others disappear. These qualities do not prevent extinction at smaller scales, but they influence whether something larger can remain. The repeated extinctions that have marked Earth's history illustrate how different pressures test these qualities in distinct ways. Cooling alters habitats by redistributing water and changing coastlines. Oxygen loss affects the availability of breathable environments. Warming shifts chemistry and circulation. Darkness interrupts the flow of energy at the surface. Each event applies a different filter, shaping which forms can continue and which cannot. No single adaptation addresses all of these challenges, and no single moment determines the outcome across all future changes. Within this sequence, the continuity of sharks reflects how a lineage can move through multiple filters without remaining unchanged. Their presence across these intervals does not imply that they were always the most numerous or the most influential, but that enough variation existed within them to meet the conditions that followed each disruption. The pattern becomes clearer when viewed across the full span, where survival appears not as a single success, but as a series of passages shaped by changing circumstances. This broader view extends beyond the ocean. It suggests that life on Earth is not arranged around permanent winners, but around shifting balances that respond to the planet's ongoing transformation. The conditions that favor one group in one period may not favor it in another, and the stability of any arrangement is tied to factors that can change beyond the control of the organisms within it. The sea, in this sense, holds a long memory of transitions rather than guarantees. Its history is marked by cycles of abundance and reduction, by moments of complexity followed by intervals of simplification, and by the gradual rebuilding that follows each disruption. Within these cycles, the persistence of any lineage is shaped by how it fits into a system that is itself evolving. From this perspective, sharks offer a quiet illustration rather than a singular answer. Their continuity reflects the interplay between variation and change, between loss and persistence, within a planet that does not remain fixed. The lesson that emerges is not about invulnerability, but about the ways in which life can continue within conditions that are always shifting, where the future is shaped not by permanence, but by the capacity to adapt as the world around it transforms. There is a sense, at the end of this long passage, that the ocean does not forget even as it changes. Its surface reflects the present, but its depths carry traces of older worlds, layered quietly beneath one another. Within those layers, the presence of sharks extends far back, reaching into a time before forests spread across continents, before the outlines of familiar animals took shape, before many of the systems now taken for granted had even begun. Their lineage was already moving through ancient seas, part of an early chapter that would continue through many revisions of the planet itself. Across that span, the ocean did not hold steady. It shifted through cold and warmth, through altered chemistry and disrupted light, through expansions and retreats that changed the boundaries of life. Each major extinction marked a different kind of ending, not a repetition of the same event, but a distinct transformation that reshaped the conditions under which life could exist. The late Ordovician brought cooling and the withdrawal of shallow seas. The Devonian saw waters lose oxygen in complex and extended ways. The end Permian pushed conditions toward extremes that affected nearly every aspect of marine systems. The end-Triassic introduced another broad chemical shift. The end Cretaceous arrived with sudden darkness and the interruption of energy at the surface. These were not moments that passed lightly. They altered ecosystems at their foundations, removing entire groups and leaving others to continue within reduced and unfamiliar environments. The ocean, after each event, did not return to what it had been. It reorganized, slowly and unevenly, building new systems from what remained. Each recovery carried forward only part of the previous world, creating something different in its place. Within this sequence, sharks persisted, not as a single unchanging form, but as a lineage that moved through each transformation. Some branches ended, others continued, and new variations emerged as conditions allowed. Their continuity reflects this pattern of change, where survival is tied to the ability of a lineage to exist across shifting circumstances rather than to resist them entirely. The ocean's history shows that persistence often involves loss, and that what endures does so by adapting to what follows. The idea of endurance, in this context, takes on a quieter meaning. It is not a matter of remaining untouched, but of continuing through disruption with some part of a lineage intact. Sharks illustrate this through their presence across multiple transitions, each one different in cause and effect. Their history becomes a thread that runs through changing environments, connecting distant periods without remaining fixed in any one form. As the present ocean continues its own course, the memory of these earlier passages remains embedded within it. The systems now in place are shaped by past events, just as they will influence what comes next. The continuity of sharks sits within this broader context, part of a living world that reflects both its history and its ongoing change. In the end, the story settles into a form that resists simple conclusions. Earth has reached many points where life was reduced, where entire communities were lost, and where the structure of the ocean was altered in fundamental ways. Yet within those broken intervals, some lineages continued, carrying forward into the next arrangement of the world. Sharks remain among them, not because they were beyond the reach of these events, but because enough of their lineage endured each time. Their presence today is part of a longer continuity, one that extends through multiple endings and into the present ocean. The memory of that passage lingers quietly, held within the water and the stone beneath it, where the history of life continues to unfold without final resolution.